The fold note. The business card lay face down on the white tablecloth, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in the dining room of Solène dared to breathe. The shabby man at table 9 had just turned it over. Embossed on the front was a name the manager standing beside him had been cashing paychecks under for 6 years. The fork in the manager's hand slipped from his cold, ringing note that cut clean through the hush.
You can't hide forever.
But to understand why one falling fork could shake an empire, you have to go back 3 hours, to a penthouse on the 40th floor where that same man stood in front of a mirror, smearing ash across his cheekbones. Theodore Hale was 58 years old, and the clothes he was pulling on were older than half the people who worked for him. A faded canvas jacket worn through at both elbows. Coarse trousers, stained with marks he had never once managed to wash out. He kept them in the back corner of his closet, behind rows of tailored suits that each cost more than a year's wages for most of his staff. For 35 years, he had not touched them. Tonight he buttoned the jacket slowly, the way a man handles something that still has teeth. His chief of staff, Adelaide Voss, leaned against the doorframe with her arms folded. She had been at his side for 12 years. She had watched him close billion-dollar acquisitions and stare down boardrooms full of men twice his size. This was different. You could send a professional, she said. An inspector. Someone trained for this kind of thing. Someone who doesn't have your face. Theodore met her eyes in the mirror, fingertips dragging a streak of gray along his jaw. No one trained sees what I need to see. The anonymous letter had landed on his desk a week ago. No return address. Just a 10-second video clip and 3 typed lines. The video showed a ragged man being dragged out the front doors of a restaurant by a security guard, while well-dressed diners laughed into their wine. The 3 lines read, "Solène, your restaurant, your responsibility. Or isn't it?" Solène's downtown location was the worst performing site in his entire chain. Every quarterly report blamed the same things: the neighborhood, the economy, a shifting customer base. But Theodore had built his fortune on a single principle, and he repeated it to every new hire on their first morning. Every person who walks through that door is owed dignity, whether they arrive in a limousine or on foot with holes in their shoes. If that principle was being trampled under his own name, he was not going to read about it in a spreadsheet. He slid the watch off his wrist, worked the wedding ring over his knuckle, set both on the dresser without looking at them. The only thing he kept was a slim phone hidden inside a compartment he had carved into the sole of his left shoe years ago, back when he still thought he might one day need to disappear. As he reached the door, Adelaide tried one last time. "Theodore, at least take a man with you." He stopped. The scar across the back of his right hand, the one he had carried since he was 23, since the night a head cook shoved him into a hot stovetop for daring to dig through a restaurant's garbage, seemed to wake up under his skin and burn. 35 years ago, he said quietly. No one was there to protect me, and right now, tonight, no one is protecting the people walking through that door either. Adelaide held his gaze a long moment, then nodded. "I'll be across the street with the legal team. One signal from that phone, and we are inside in 30 seconds. Legally, by the book, no improvising." A small, tired smile. "That," he said, "is why I keep you." By 7 on a Saturday evening, Solène glittered. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across white linen. The air carried seared beef and expensive wine and the low murmur of people who had paid $200 a plate for the privilege of being seen in the right room, men in cut suits, women dripping with stones that caught the light every time they laughed. Renata Carter had worked the floor here for 3 years, long enough to know that the shine on the surface was hiding something gone soft underneath. She moved between the tables with the practiced ease of someone the room had decided not to see, which was exactly how service workers were supposed to move: invisible, efficient. Her feet had been aching since noon, but she did not let herself slow down, because slowing down was a luxury she could not afford. Her daughter, Maya, was 7, and there was another specialist appointment next week, and the copay on the asthma inhaler had gone up again. Her younger brother's final tuition installment came due at the end of the month. Renata kept the whole fragile arithmetic running in the back of her mind like a second heartbeat. She had learned young to read people through their eyes. It was a survival skill, sharpened in rooms where a girl like her had never been meant to belong. She could tell within seconds whether a customer would tip or stiff her, whether they saw a person carrying their plate or just a pair of hands. So when the front door swung open and a homeless man stepped inside, she registered immediately that something was wrong. Not with him, with everyone else. He was disheveled, sure. The torn jacket, the unkempt beard, the unmistakable smell of someone who hadn't slept indoors. But the posture was off. The shoulders too square, the walk too certain. The eyes, dark and steady, sweeping the room and filing away every detail. Those were not the eyes of a man life had finished with. The hostess tried to block him, her smile frozen into something closer to horror. Then Garrett Doyle appeared. Doyle had managed Selene for 5 years. He wore his authority like a blade, and he liked to use it on anyone he had decided ranked beneath him, which was nearly everyone. He smiled at investors and regulars. Renata had seen how he spoke to the dishwashers when he thought the floor was empty. "Sir," Doyle said, his voice sugared and false, "I'm afraid you've come to the wrong place. This establishment may not suit your present situation." The man didn't flinch. He reached into a pocket and drew out a thick fold of cash, more than Renata cleared in a month. "Table 9, he said, calm as still water, the Wagyu, A5, cooked medium rare. I'll pay in advance." A ripple ran through the nearest tables. Doyle's smile flickered between greed and disgust. "Rule 1 of the trade. You do not turn away a paying customer." "Of course," he managed through his teeth, and led the man to the worst table in the house, jammed into a corner beside the kitchen doors and the restroom hallway, where the noise was loudest and the smell from the bins occasionally drifted in. It was the table they used for guests they wanted to shame into leaving on their own. The man sat without complaint. Doyle scanned the floor and his eyes landed on Renata. "You," he said, "always going on about helping the less fortunate. Here's your chance to prove it." It was meant as a punishment, and they both understood it perfectly. Renata walked over, water pitcher in hand, and poured a glass without lifting her eyes. But as she set it down, she felt him watching her, and she looked up. His eyes caught hers, and something passed between them she could not have named, a kind of recognition that raised the hair along her arms. This man was not what he was pretending to be. In the kitchen, Doyle pulled the sous chef into a blind corner the cameras couldn't reach. Elias Brennan was 28 and had been at Selene 2 years. He was good enough to run his own line someday. But his wife was 7 months pregnant at home, and a stack of medical bills had him chained to this place. "The Wagyu for the bum," Doyle said, dropping his voice. "Use the cut that came back yesterday. The one that sat out 2 hours before we put it back in the freezer." Elias's stomach dropped. "Garrett, that meat's gone. If he eats it, what? He gets a stomachache. Who's going to believe a homeless man over a 5-star kitchen?" Doyle gave a low laugh. "Probably eats out of dumpsters anyway. Call it a favor. Best meal of his life. And if he gets seriously sick..." Doyle's face hardened. "Remember that $2,000 bottle you dropped last month? The one I said I'd take care of so it didn't come out of your check?" He let the threat hang. "Do what I tell you, Elias. Unless you'd rather explain to your pregnant wife why you're unemployed." Elias stood frozen. Then, slowly, he nodded. Doyle clapped his shoulder. "Good man." Neither of them noticed Renata behind the spice rack, close enough to catch every word. Her heart slammed so hard she was certain the whole kitchen could hear it. As Doyle brushed past her on his way out, Elias turned and nearly collided with her. Their eyes met, and she saw the guilt written all over his face. He shook his head once, slowly. A silent warning. Don't say anything. Forget what you heard." But here is the thing Renata did not know, the thing she would not learn until hours later. As Elias bent over his cutting board, his trembling hand slid into the pocket of his apron and found his phone. He pressed record. Then he wedged the phone upright in a gap between 2 steel shelves, lens angled straight at the spot where Doyle had just stood giving the order. Elias did not have the courage to refuse the man to his face, but he had just enough fear and just enough decency left to make sure that one day he would not be the one standing in a courtroom in Doyle's place. Renata carried herself back onto the floor on legs that felt borrowed. She set down a tray and pretended to reorganize the silverware station, buying time to think. If she stayed quiet, she kept her job. She paid for Maya's inhaler, her brother's tuition. She survived. If she spoke up, no one would believe her. Doyle would shred her name and fire her on the spot, and she would lose the whole fragile life she had built. But if she did nothing, that man would eat poisoned food, and whatever happened to him would land on her hands. Her eyes drifted up to the black domes mounted in the ceiling corners. 6 over the main floor, 2 by the entrance, 1 aimed at the bar. Doyle reviewed the footage every night, hunting for any reason to dock pay. Last month, he'd fired a busboy over a 5-minute break. If she warned the man out loud, Doyle would know within the hour. There had to be a way to do something the cameras couldn't catch. The staff restroom. The only room in the building without a lens. She slipped down the hallway, locked the door, and leaned against the sink, breathing slow to steady her hands. Her reflection looked back at her, a tired woman in a black uniform, hair pulled tight, shadows under her eyes, and under all of it, her mother's face. The memory came sharp and uninvited. Her mother on the hospital bed, thin fingers wrapped around Renata's hand. "Baby girl, there's going to come a day when doing the right thing costs you everything you have, but if you don't do it, you lose yourself. And that's the one thing you can't get back." Renata had been 24 then, already carrying Maya, already left behind by the man who'd promised to stay. She'd thought she understood. Now, 8 years later, locked in a restroom stall with a decision that could break her, she finally did. She tore a strip off her order pad, no bigger than a matchbook, and wrote fast, the letters cramped and uneven. "Don't eat it. The meat is spoiled. On purpose. They want to hurt you." She folded it down until it disappeared into the curve of her palm. The scrap felt like it weighed 100 pounds. When she came back through the kitchen, Elias was plating the steak. She saw him hesitate as he laid the meat on the white dish, his jaw tight, seared a deep, glistening brown, dressed with roasted vegetables and a ribbon of reduction. Nobody looking at it would ever guess. "Elias," she said quietly, "you can't let this happen." He didn't look up. "I don't know what you're talking about. That meat sat out 2 hours. You know what that means. Stop." He turned then, and she saw the terror in his eyes, the desperate math of a man trying to protect the little he had. "I've got a baby coming in 2 months. My wife can't work right now. And if that man dies, can you live with that?" His face twisted. "What do you want me to do? Walk out there and announce Garrett told me to serve bad meat? Who believes me? He denies it, fires me for lying, and makes sure I never cook in this town again." She wanted to shake him, but looking into his face, she understood. He wasn't a bad man. He was a trapped one, like her, like everyone who worked in places where the people on top held all the power and the people on the bottom held all the risk. "Fine," she said softly. "You didn't see anything. You don't know anything." She would do this alone. She had no idea the phone in his apron was still running. The plate was ready. She lifted it onto her palm and crossed the dining room, her eyes fixed on the corner, her free hand at her side, the folded scrap pressed between 2 fingers. She reached the table's edge and set the plate down with a server's precision. "Your Wagyu, sir," she said, loud enough for the next table to hear. "Medium rare, as requested." The man looked up, and again that strange spark of recognition passed between them. She laid the silverware beside the plate, and as she did, her hand brushed his. In that single moment of contact, she pressed the note into his palm and felt his fingers close around it on instinct. "Enjoy your meal," she said, holding his eyes 1 beat too long. Then she turned and walked away, certain the whole room could hear her heart. Theodore waited until she was gone. He dropped his hand below the table and unfolded the scrap. He read it 3 times. Then he looked at the beautiful steak in front of him, the meal meant to make him sick, meant to punish him for daring to exist in a room where men like him weren't welcome. Something cold and hard settled in his chest. Not anger, not yet. Something older, something he'd buried 35 years ago and thought was gone. He remembered being 23, starving, digging through a restaurant's bins for scraps, the head cook who caught him, the hot iron edge of the range, the pain that ripped a scream out of him, the laughter of the line cooks, the names they threw, the certainty in their voices that he was worthless, that he deserved to suffer for being poor. The scar on his hand throbbed with phantom heat. He had built his entire company to prove them wrong. And here, in a restaurant bearing his own name, they were poisoning a man they believed had nothing. He set the knife and fork down, untouched. He would not eat. He would not leave. He would sit, and he would watch. And when the moment came, he would take this rotten little kingdom apart. 20 minutes passed. The steak cooled on its plate. From behind the bar, Doyle watched with a tightening unease. By now, the man should have been halfway through, should have started to feel the bacteria turning in his gut. Instead, he just sat, still and calm, like he was waiting for something. Doyle smoothed his tie and walked over. "Everything all right with your meal, sir? You haven't touched it." Theodore looked up, and there was something in his expression that left Doyle feeling like the one being measured. "The atmosphere," Theodore said. "I'm enjoying it." The cold prickle climbed the back of Doyle's neck, the instinct that had kept him out of trouble more times than he could count. This man did not behave the way a homeless man was supposed to behave. Too composed, too controlled. His eyes cut across the room to Renata, refilling water 2 tables over. She'd been alone with him. She'd said something. He'd deal with her. Half an hour later, a woman at a nearby table, draped in diamonds, waved Doyle over with an imperious flick of the wrist. "This is unacceptable," she hissed. "We are paying $400 for dinner, and we have to sit beside that." She tipped her chin at Theodore. "The smell alone is ruining my appetite." Doyle nodded with practiced sympathy. "I completely understand, ma'am. Let me handle it." He walked back to table 9, stride harder now. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We need this table for other guests." Theodore looked up, perfectly calm. "I've paid for my meal. I'll refund you in full. I don't want a refund. I want to sit here." Doyle felt his patience fraying. Around them, conversations had begun to die as heads turned. "Sir, I must insist. On what grounds?" Theodore's voice was quiet, but it carried. "I've paid. I'm not disturbing anyone. I'm sitting in a seat I paid for in a restaurant open to the public. What law am I breaking?" Doyle's mouth opened and shut. He couldn't force out a paying customer without cause, not in front of this many witnesses. If someone filmed it, the fallout would be a nightmare. He needed another angle, and his eyes found Renata again. If he couldn't blame the customer, he'd blame the staff. Doyle straightened his jacket and raised his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables. "Renata Carter, come here!" She set down the pitcher and crossed the room, each step slow and deliberate. "Yes?" Doyle turned to face her, arranging his features into righteous disappointment. "I've received complaints that you were inappropriate with this guest, that you made unprofessional, offensive comments." Her eyes widened. "That's not true. I didn't say anything." "Multiple witnesses," Doyle pressed, talking over her, "report that you deliberately tried to humiliate this gentleman. Given that, I have no choice but to suspend you immediately, pending a full investigation." The dining room went silent, every eye fixed on table 9. Renata stood frozen. By the kitchen doors, Elias watched, pale with guilt. He knew the truth. He knew she'd done nothing. But his wife, his child, his future, all of it rode on his silence. He dropped his eyes and stepped back, and in his apron, his thumb moved across the screen. The recording was still running. This time, the lens caught Doyle, in the open dining room, framing an innocent woman in front of 40 witnesses. Renata stood in the middle of the floor, surrounded by strangers, watching her humiliation like dinner theater. She thought of Maya asleep at home with the sitter, the bills on the counter, the tuition, the life she'd stitched together coming apart at the seams. She had done the right thing, and she was being punished for it while the real criminal stood in front of her wearing a self-righteous smile. Heat stung the backs of her eyes, but she would not let it fall. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice steady even as her hands shook. "I brought him his food. That's all." Doyle shook his head sadly. "The witnesses say otherwise. Collect your things and leave." She looked around the room for one person, anyone who might stand up. The other servers looked away. The diners watched with mild interest, already composing the version they'd tell friends tomorrow. No one moved. No one spoke. She was invisible. She had always been invisible. Then, from the corner table, a voice cut through the silence. She didn't say anything inappropriate. Every head turned to the ragged man, slowly rising from his seat. "She brought me my food," he continued, calm and clear. She was polite, and she was professional. That's all she did. Doyle's face hardened. "Sir, This is an internal matter. No, one word, soft, carrying the weight of absolute authority. This is a public accusation made in front of dozens of witnesses. If you're going to ruin this woman, you should at least have the decency to do it honestly. Something in the tone made Doyle take a step back. The man's posture had changed, shoulders squaring, chin lifting. He no longer looked like someone the world had thrown away. He looked like a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Who are you?" Doyle demanded. The man smiled, without an ounce of warmth. "I think it's time you found out." Theodore bent down, reached into the sole of his left shoe, and drew out the slim phone. He pressed a button. 30 seconds later, the front doors of Solène opened. Adelaide Voss came through first, heels striking sharp against the marble. Charcoal suit, expression cold and exact. Behind her came two men in dark suits, attorneys by the cases they carried, and a uniformed officer the legal team had requested in advance, by the book, so that not one thing about this night could be undone in a courtroom. No one would be held against their will. Everything would stand up. Adelaide crossed the floor, stopped beside Theodore, and turned to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. Allow me to introduce Theodore Hale, founder and owner of the entire Solène restaurant group." A gasp rolled through the dining room. The woman in diamonds went white, her hand flying to her mouth. Doyle stood rooted, the color draining from his face. Theodore stepped forward, and even in the torn jacket, even with ash still streaked across his face, he carried himself like a man who had built something from nothing. "I've recorded everything tonight," he said, lifting the phone. "But I don't need it to prove the part that matters most." He turned toward the kitchen doors. "Elias Brennan, you have a choice. You can tell the truth about what happened here, or someone else will tell it for you." And then the thing nobody expected. Elias walked out of the kitchen, his own phone in his hand, screen still glowing. His voice cracked, but it didn't stop. "I recorded all of it. When he ordered me to use the spoiled cut, when he threatened to fire me if I refused, and just now, when he blamed Renata for something she never did." He set the phone on table 9. Beside the business card Theodore had laid there. I was too scared to say no to his face. But I wasn't going to be the man who just stood there. He turned to Renata. "You were braver than me. This is the part I can do." The dining room erupted. Diners cried out in disgust, several shoving their own plates away. Doyle backed up, hands raised. "He's lying. This is a setup. The recording doesn't lie," Theodore said, "and neither do the books." He nodded to one of the attorneys, who opened a case and drew out a bound stack of paper. "For the past week, my audit team has been going through this location's ledgers. There's a very simple pattern any accountant in the country can find. When one person repeatedly voids transactions after a guest has already paid in cash, then pockets the difference, it has a name: void fraud. Over 18 months, more than 400 transactions were voided under your login. A few dozen to a few $100s each. Always on shifts when you closed a loan." He laid the stack down, just under $200,000. "You thought no one would notice because each piece was small. But a small thing repeated enough times becomes a pattern, and a pattern doesn't know how to lie." Doyle's face collapsed. He turned to bolt, but the officer was already there, calm and procedural, reading him his rights exactly as the law required. "You can't do this to me," Doyle shouted. "I gave this place 5 years. Theodore walked toward him and stopped a few feet away. 35 years ago, he said quietly, a man burned my hand against a hot range because I was starving and going through his garbage. He laughed while I screamed. He told me I was worthless, that I deserved to suffer for being poor. He raised the back of his right hand, the pale scar running across it. I built this company so no one would ever be treated that way in a place that carried my name, and you turned it into exactly the kind of place I swore to destroy." Doyle stared at him, the fight gone out of his body. "Officer," Adelaide said evenly, "Mr. Doyle will be facing charges: attempted poisoning, embezzlement, fraud." From somewhere outside, sirens grew closer. An hour later, the restaurant had emptied. The police had taken Doyle away in cuffs, still protesting his innocence to anyone who'd listen. The diners had gone home with refunds and apologies. The staff had been sent home, told that corporate would be in touch. Only Theodore and Renata remained. She sat near the window, staring at her hands. The adrenaline had drained out, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion behind. She had done the right thing. She had saved a man's life, and still she felt hollow, unsure what came next. Theodore sat down across from her. He had washed the ash from his face, though he still wore the ragged clothes. Up close, without the grime, she could see him clearly for the first time. The sharp intelligence in his eyes, the quiet steadiness in how he held himself. "You knew," he said. "When you wrote that note, you knew it could cost you everything. Your job, your daughter's care, your brother's tuition. Why?" She looked up. "Because 35 years ago, someone didn't help you when you needed it, and you've been carrying that ever since." His expression shifted, surprise breaking through his composure. "How did you know that?" "I saw it in your eyes when I brought the water," she said simply. Those weren't the eyes of a homeless man. They were the eyes of someone who used to be one. Someone who still remembers exactly what it felt like. He was quiet a long moment. "You read people. It's not a gift," she said. "It's survival. When you grow up the way I did, you learn to see what people are really thinking. It's the only way to stay safe." He nodded slowly. He understood that kind of survival better than most. "What happens now?" she asked. "The restaurant closes for renovation. New management, new training, new everything." He leaned forward. "And I need someone to lead it. Someone who understands what this place was supposed to be. Someone with the courage to do the right thing even when it costs them." She stared at him. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a choice," he corrected. "This isn't charity and it isn't a reward. It's an opportunity. Take it or leave it." 1 week later, Renata's phone rang. She was at her kitchen table, Maya asleep in the next room, the familiar stack of bills spread out in front of her. "Mrs. Carter, this is Adelaide Voss. Mr. Hale has asked me to extend a formal offer for the position of general manager at Selene, effective on reopening, competitive salary, full benefits, including comprehensive health coverage for your family. He wanted me to stress that this is your decision. No pressure, no expectations." Renata closed her eyes. She thought of her mother's words, about doing the right thing even when it costs everything, about losing yourself if you didn't. She had done the right thing, and instead of losing everything, she had been handed a beginning. "I'll take it," she said. "But I have one condition." There was a second call she had asked Adelaide to consider. Elias Brennan had walked out of Selene that night, certain he was finished, certain the recording that brought down his boss had also ended his own career. He was wrong. The new training program needed a head of kitchen who knew from the inside exactly how a frightened cook gets pushed into doing something he hates. Who better to build a culture where no one ever feels that trapped again than the man who'd lived it and found, at the last second, the nerve to do something about it? When Adelaide made the call, Elias didn't speak for a long moment. Then, in a thick voice, he said yes. His daughter was born 3 weeks later. He named her after no one in particular. He just liked the sound of a name that meant brave. 3 months later, Selene reopened. The bones were the same, but the room was warmer now, softer light, gentler music. A staff trained in a single philosophy that Renata had helped write into the manual herself. Every person who walks through these doors is owed dignity, no matter how they look or what they can pay. And folded into that philosophy was the second part of her condition. Once a week, the kitchen prepared a community table, a quiet menu offered with no questions asked to anyone who came in hungry and short, no separate entrance, no marked seating. They sat among everyone else, served on the same white porcelain. Renata stood near the entrance in a tailored black suit, greeting guests. She carried herself differently than she had 3 months before, shoulders straight, chin level, eyes clear. The door opened and a man came in, his clothes worn, his shoes held together with tape. He looked around nervously, braced to be thrown out. The hostess glanced toward Renata. Renata walked forward before anyone else could move. "Welcome to Selene," she said warmly, extending her hand. "Would you like a table by the window?" The man stared, waiting for the catch, the cruel joke. There was none. "I don't have much money," he admitted quietly. She smiled. "That's all right. Thursday is community night, and you've come on the right evening. Please, come in." She led him to a table by the window, the best seat in the house. On her way back, she passed a small frame mounted near the entrance. Inside it, a scrap of paper, creased and worn, in cramped handwriting. "Don't eat it. The meat is spoiled on purpose. They want to hurt you. Below it, a small plaque. One act of courage can change everything. This note saved a life and brought down a corrupt system. Dignity is not a privilege. It is a right. Renata Carter, general manager. That had been her condition. And every time a new hire began training, they stood in front of that frame and learned the story of the night everything changed. The night a billionaire dressed as a homeless man walked into a restaurant, and a waitress with everything to lose risked all of it to save him, and a frightened cook found at the very last second that he was braver than he believed. Because sometimes the people with the least power are the ones who change everything. A quick word before you go. I sat with this story for a long time before I told it, because the part that stays with me isn't the twist or the takedown. It's the choice 3 different people made when no one was watching and everyone had a reason to look away. Renata could have kept her head down and kept her paycheck. Elias could have buried that phone and protected himself. Theodore could have stayed in his penthouse and let the spreadsheet keep lying to him. None of them did. And here's the thing I keep coming back to. Courage almost never looks like a hero in a spotlight. Usually it looks like a tired person doing the scary, costly, right thing in a quiet hallway, certain no one will ever know. The world runs on those invisible moments far more than it runs on the loud ones. So let me leave you with a question, and I'd really like to hear your answer down in the comments. If you were Renata, holding that folded note in your hand, knowing exactly what it might cost you, would you have written it? Be honest. I'm not sure I would have. Tell me below.